The Book of Esther is considered a historic novella, which, depending on the commentator that you're reading, will be a range of how much actual history is this depicting and how much is it a novel to make a number of points. And I think it's probably like some of those movies that might say, that start out saying inspired by a true story, or rather than based on a true story, because you can't actually connect a king with this particular name. I mean, some attempts are made with some names. The setting is likely to be in the 4th century, and there were times where a single king did rule over the whole Persian Empire, which was quite vast. And so those things, you know, the setting, one could well imagine that something like this happened. Now it's interesting that, and I hope I brought enough for everybody here. If we have time, I'm going to share with you some of the differences between how the Jewish community works with the Book of Esther versus the Christian community. And a few people may need to share, because there were only 7 of you here last week, I heard. There you go. So, as most of you probably have heard before, that the Book of Esther never mentions God. Have you heard that? And there are only 2 books in the whole Bible that don't ever mention God: Song of Solomon and the Book of Esther. And so it makes one wonder, well, why is this book included in the canon? And some would say that, well, and I find this to be true now, I'm a deep believer in God, but you don't hear me in conversation saying, well, God made this happen or God made that happen, because it's just not the way I talk about my faith. And this book might actually speak very well to our age, which tends to be a more secular age, because it doesn't make a specific reference to God, and yet there are implications throughout the whole book. And when the story is told with the addition of the Talmud, or what the Jewish rabbis would add in the meaning of the story, they certainly see God's hand throughout the story. So in a more secular culture, one might say God is hidden but very much at work. But through the character, the human beings in the story are the instruments that God depends upon for God's purpose to be fulfilled. And that purpose in this story is to lift up the heroic courage of Esther and her cousin Mordecai to prevent a genocide of the Jewish people. And to show again that God is on the side of the oppressed. God is a liberator, God who has always protected the chosen people. Here is another example of God at work. Now, the Jewish festival of Purim is, this story in totality is read the first evening of Purim and again the next morning. And it's celebrated, and it's usually around the season of February, March. It moves around just like our Easter moves around. But some of the ways that it is celebrated is that another name for the Book of Esther is Megillah, and which is an account of the Purim miracle. In the Jewish tradition, besides the reading of the book of Esther twice, you're also supposed to give money gifts to at least 2 poor people, send gifts of 2 different kinds of food to at least 1 person, and have a wonderful feast, which usually includes intoxicating beverages. And sometimes little girls will dress up as if they're the queen. So that's all lifting up some of the very positive dimensions of this book. When you have feminist critique of this story, different things are lifted up. And let me just share some of those. Some say that Esther has been idealized more than she truly was as a human being, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a minute. She's lifted up as the ultimate Jewish mother who risks her life to save her children through modesty, loyalty, and quiet courage, and therefore is a paradigm of virtue. But a whole nother way of looking at it, through the eyes of a South African theologian, Mosala, is that he thinks the whole context of the story shows how feudal and patriarchal, F-E-U-D-A-L, and patriarchal the setting is in the story. And that you can see that starts off right from the start with Queen Vashti, right? When the king, who's used to getting whatever he wants to parade her around for her to show her beauty. Now, some of the Talmud says the reason that was such an abominable request is that it suggests he wanted her to do that only wearing her crown, in other words, naked. But either way, she refused, and who knows, maybe she was just fed up with being objectified for her body or her beauty. But the fact that he then ordered all these he ordered her death, and I thought it was almost humorous about, well, if we let her get away with this, then every woman in the whole Persian Empire is going to start rebuking their husband's orders. So we can't let that happen. And the level of threat that this portrays just amazes me. But it actually tragically also reminded me of when some of us on the Civil Rights Movement trip recently went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, otherwise known as the Lynching Museum, and how African Americans were lynched without the slightest cause, just for looking at someone, or for protesting that their relative had been lynched. And so you already, right in the very beginning, see this patriarchal power imbalance that the women and then the Jews lived in. And so the South African theologian talks about, of course, it lifts up the lavish court of the king, but it never references the slave labor that built it. And what is not said sometimes becomes more important than what is said. It focuses on the cultural and national survival of the Jews, and the price of survival is that Esther is incorporated into this feudal hierarchical structure, and that she and the Jewish people bought into the ruling ideology and condoned the use of forced labor on the lands and islands of the king. Now, one might argue, and we certainly can, did they have any choice? But I don't know if you noticed as you were reading through the number of times it says at least 3 different times, but they did no looting. And so this was also part of this, at least from the South African theologian's perspective. They were carrying out the orders, but they didn't touch the property. They didn't really challenge the feudal power, who was in power and what they possessed. And so he claims that the Jews had adopted the prevailing ideology that condoned the slaughter of human enemies but protected private property. And he also criticized the choice of a female character to achieve the patriarchal objectives. The gender struggle of women to be independently themselves is sacrificed to the struggles of the nationhood. So he draws a parallel between Esther and the struggle of black women in South Africa. So this story has many different takes on it. It's also been lifted up by feminists, Christians, who are saying, well, good for Queen Vashti that she refused the king's order, and how courageous was Esther to actually potentially sacrifice herself in order to save the Jewish people. And of course, it's that heroic tribute that the Jewish tradition lifts up. So let me just stop there and see if what would you notice in this story, either as a critique of it or as a positive model for courage, for faithful courage.
I thought it was interesting that she subjected herself to this year preamble, whatever it is, join the harem, get
cosmetics and all that, right.
Not knowing if it would ever come to fruition. You know, she sacrificed herself not knowing how she might be used or how it might come to something positive now.
Right. And even that, it's interesting that one take on that would be, did she have any choice? Another take on it from the Talmud is that she did not want to be noticed by the king more than any other woman because he was a Gentile. It was not her choice to be taken to his court. It was not her choice to be married to him. In fact, the Talmud tradition suggests she was actually Mordecai's wife, not just a niece or a cousin. And if she had given herself to the king, she would voluntarily, she would no longer ever be able to be his wife. And so in the Talmud tradition, they lift up that she took as minimal amount of those cosmetics as she could get away with. They also lift up that she was a faithful Jew even though she did not reveal her Jewish identity by having 7 different maids attend to her, which after she was queen, which meant that on the Sabbath day, the maid that was attending to her would not know that all the days, or that the other days of the week, she was fasting. You know, they would only know that on that particular day that she was. So there wasn't any observable celebration of kosher food or of the fasting and praying. So it's really interesting to see how the Jewish tradition has delved into her character and showed how she remained faithful as a Jew herself. Other thoughts? Yes.
It just struck me in reading this is an argument that God wanted to save the Jewish people, and this is part of the Christian Bible. So how can Nazis and all that justify the Holocaust if this is in the Christian Bible?
It just shows the sinfulness of humanity. We read into the Bible what we want to read into the Bible. So, for example, we know in the United States that the Bible was used to justify slavery. And there are many times in the Bible where slaves and masters are addressed, and there's not a challenge to the status of slavery. They're just addressed, right? But what was never lifted up in the southern United States church when they were using the Bible to legitimate slavery was that slavery predated race, and there's no reference to race in the Bible whatsoever. And so justifying the racism that undergirded slavery cannot be justified in the scriptures. And yet it was. I mean, that whole gap didn't bother people that were using it that way. Mm-hmm.
One thing that kind of came through to me is kind of how brutal kings were to reinforce their rule. I mean, we see a little bit of it with the other kings in the Bible, but this really lands on it hard. And the other thing is it's kind of Game of Thrones-like, basically anything is fair game and very absolute and brutal, including these harems and the eunuchs to care for. That was actually worldwide. South America, Africa, Asia, huge harems, absolute kings, kill everybody. So that this whole notion of kingship really is a pretty bad thing far back. It probably got a little better in more modern times. And the thing that strikes me is we use king a lot, Lord, king, whatever, in our terminology, hardly thinking about it. Kings were pretty brutal in history. And I don't know, that's kind of what comes out for me is how kind of the accepted brutality all the way around.
Right.
So yes, the king was bad, but that was kind of the way things were done.
Right.
So that's the thing that it reinforced for me.
Right.
Also Hadassah, the Jewish women's charitable organization, Hadassah. So that was Esther's name, I guess,
yes.
first. And so some of those things came through too.
Right. The lack of questioning the violence and the king's power, and the fact that Haman or Haman, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, freely built the gallows, to kill Mordecai, and then just the very next day when the king misinterprets his plea for mercy at Esther's couch or whatever, and took it to mean that he was attacking Esther, and then he gets hung instead, or his head cut off instead. I mean, it's just like, this is a very X-rated for violence kind of story.
None of these decrees can be reversed.
Yes,
they're so, whatever it is, omniscient, or it's just so absolute, you can never reverse it, which I find kind of bizarre.
Yeah. And that also undergirds, some might be critical of Esther, that when Mordecai first goes to her and says, "You're our only hope," because she was the only one that really had the ears of the king. And her response, but to me, this is like most of the biblical characters, when they first hear the challenge, and I would say from God, this is yours to do. Even Mother Mary would say, well, how can that be? And we tend to lift up Mary as a very willing handmaiden of God, and she was, but it's not without an initial question, which I would certainly have had. And it's, he hasn't even asked for me for 30 days, and now you're telling me to go and talk with him, and that someone could be killed if they just ask for an audience, and it's not the king's initiative. So some say, well, it wasn't that she was that courageous, but what did she end up actually doing? Was courageous, right? Even though she may have had her initial misgivings. And so in your handout, I want to lift up 2 verses that are italicized in Esther 4, down in verse 14. And I lift up these 2 verses because if ever one was to try to discern where is the invisible hand of God at work, these 2 verses make that reference. when Esther's first saying, well, I don't know if I'm up to this, or I'm not sure this is going to work, Mordecai told those who sent her message back, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." The Methodist pastor at one of our neighboring churches would often pray at the beginning of our meetings, "God, who knows, you may have called us for just such a time as this." That one verse, "for such a time as this," is probably the most referenced verse of Esther that we hear. Perhaps you've been called for just such a time as this. And I love it that Mordecai starts it with a question, who knows? But he's open to the possibility. And this is where I read God's hand, both because Mordecai says, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. So God is going to save the Jewish people. That's going to happen. However, if you do this may be exactly what God is hoping you will take up. You may be the one. This may be the reason you're on this earth, is for such a time as this. And then the other verse down below is in chapter 8. There's also an affirmation of this larger purpose of protecting the Jewish people. If Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And so these hints of God's victory through Mordecai and Esther are implicit. But granted, you have to look for them, right? Okay, Ted?
The other thing that popped out, occurred to me as we were reading this, is several of these foundational stories for the Jews are around basically sort of a nobody making good in the prevailing civilization of the time. Joseph going to Egypt, Moses becoming quite important. So Jews who are kind of thrust into a foreign power basically becoming in charge, becoming the queen, becoming important. So in a way, this is part of the Jewish, well, they're important. They can do anything, and so it's a uplifting, positive, another lesson that anything's possible.
Right. And if you think about the Jewish festivals, they're almost always as an oppressed people that have been liberated, right? Because that's their history, is both a chosen people but an oppressed people.
But also in charge. I mean, they end up being,
But they
in these
end up
cases,
being-
they're in charge. They're not just liberated, they're liberated on top, if you
Right,
will.
right.
It's sort of accepting that you have been chosen.
Yeah,
put in
another
that position,
flavor of chosen.
sense of,
Yeah.
I would think too, on a personal level, she must have had a little degree of relief in sort of outing yourself rather than being discovered.
To be hidden, to hide your whole identity under someone that could kill you. Coming out of the closet, if you will, and claiming yourself and claiming your whole people. And it's also interesting to think about how God uses the king also. I mean, the king did not want to see the Jewish people, did not want Esther killed or see the Jewish people killed. And the Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, was also used by God. I mean, the narrative in the Bible is that God worked through him as well. So God working through people it's not only just through the Hebrew people that God is working.
Is there any doubt that Mordecai is Jewish? I'm not quite sure that italicized text that you've got there.
There is
Of
no.
the Jewish people, wasn't that generally known?
I took it more as a math teacher, geometry or math teacher's kind of presentation of if this, then therefore that. And
Oh, knowing it's already true, so you're
yeah,
doing,
if the
okay.
light's on, somebody must have hit the switch.
Right,
By saying, if truth be told.
right,
That kind of thing.
okay,
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's,
yeah.
yeah. Other comments? Okay, we're going to close with a litany written by, since this is our, I guess we do one more book after Christmas of the Old Testament, Isaiah, do we? Or can't remember, but I knew that, I'm sorry, we'll have to share a little bit on this too. Miriam Therese Winter, who wrote a chapter for every single woman in the Bible that she could find, except sometimes there are some unnamed women in groups. But she just put the whole story of Esther in her book, and then followed it with this psalm that she wrote for many different women of the Bible. So I thought it'd be fun to end, this is just of the Old Testament. But since it includes both Queen Vashti and Esther, I thought it'd be a fun way to conclude before Christmas. So let's take turns being the leader, and Craig, we'll start with you, and then we'll all be all. And we'll just go around. Okay.
Remember Eve, our matriarch, and mother of all the living.
We praise you, Eve, and all the women who have had to make difficult choices in seductive environments.
Remember Hagar, matriarch of a portion of God's people.
We praise you, Hagar, and all women who bravely bear the burden of being laid second class.
Remember Shirpa and Pua, midwives in the land of bondage.
We praise you, Shipra and Hua, and all women who risk their lives to bring forth life when the laws are stacked against them.
Remember Miriam, prophetic leader of the Exodus.
We praise you, Miriam, and all women who have challenged male authority and been cursed with banishment.
Remember Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, feminists in the Promised Land.
We praise you, Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, and all women who have pushed religious authority to consider gender equality.
Remember Jael, liberator of her people.
We praise you, Jael, and all women who have single-handedly saved us from destruction of any kind.
Remember the heroine of Thebes, who spontaneously saved her people.
We praise you, heroine of Thebes, and all women who waste no time in solving problems, who learn through experience.
Remember the Shunammite woman, the prophet Elijah's friend.
We praise you, Shunammite women, and all women who refuse to be dismissed.
Remember Rizpah, a mother who had to deal with kings.
We praise you, Rizpah, and all women who stand firm and refuse to cover up a patriarchal sin.
Remember Judith, a widow and savior of her people.
We praise you, Judith, and all women who make the impossible possible and do it with finesse.
Remember Queen Vashti, who resisted pressure from the throne.
We praise you, Queen Vashti, and all women who resist the pressure to parade and perform before the eyes of men.
Remember Esther, our sister Hadassah, the courage of her
We praise you, Esther, and our sister Hadassah, and all women who use their status to foster life, who have intervened to counteract genocidal extermination. We remember all our heroines, named and unnamed, known and unknown. We thank you and we praise you. Amen.
So if there are any women's names there that you don't know, then I encourage you over Christmas to look them up in the Bible.